Section 6 of the Vedanta Sutras by Badarayana, with the commentary by Shankaracharya, Volume 1, translated by George Thibault. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Introduction, Part 6. Sutra 9 constitutes in Shankara's view a new adhikarana, proving that in the passage, quote, "Let a man meditate," end quote, the Omkara and the Udgita stand in the relation of one specifying the other, the meaning being, quote, "Let a man meditate on that Omkara which," end quote, etc. According to Ramanuja's interpretation, which seems to fall in more satisfactorily with the form and the wording of the sutra, the latter merely furnishes an additional argument for the conclusion arrived at in the preceding adhikarana. Adhikarana 5 determines the unity of the so-called prana vidyas and the consequent comprehension of the different qualities of the prana, which are mentioned in the different texts, within one meditation. Adhikarana 6 comprises, according to Shankara, the sutras 11 through 13. The point to be settled is whether in all the meditations on Brahman all its qualities are to be included, or only those mentioned in the special vidya. The decision is that the essential and unalterable attributes of Brahman, such as bliss and knowledge, are to be taken into account everywhere, while those which admit of a more or less, as for instance the attribute of having joy for its head mentioned in the Taittiriya Upanishad, are confined to special meditations. Adhikarana 7, according to Shankara, aims at proving that the object of Katha Upanishad 3, 10, 11 is one only, namely to show that the highest self is higher than everything, so that the passage constitutes one vidya only. Adhikarana 8 determines, according to Shankara, that the self spoken of in Aitareya Aranyaka 2, 4, 1, 1 is not a lower form of the self, the so-called Sutratman, but the highest self. The discussion of that point in this place being due to the wish to prove that the attributes of the highest self have to be comprehended in the Aitarchaka meditation. According to Ramanuja, the sutras 11 through 17 constitute a single adhikarana whose subject is the same as that of Shankara's 6th adhikarana. Sutras 11 through 13 are, on the whole, explained as by Shankara. Sutra 12, however, is said to mean, quote, "Such attributes as having joy for its head, etc., are not to be viewed as qualities of Brahman, and therefore not to be included in every meditation, for if they were admitted as qualities, difference would be introduced into Brahman's nature, and that would involve a more or less on Brahman's part." End quote. Sutras 14 through 17 continued the discussion of the passage about the Priyasarastva. If Priyasarastva, etc., are not to be viewed as real qualities of Brahman, for what purpose does the text mention them? Quote, "Because," Sutra 14 replies, "there is no other purpose, Scripture mentions them for the purpose of pious meditation." End quote. But how is it known that the self of delight is the highest self, owing to which you maintain that having limbs, head, etc. cannot belong to it as attributes? Quote, "Because," Sutra 15 replies, "the term self, Atma Anandamaya, is applied to it." End quote. But in the previous parts of the chapter, the term self, in Atma Pranamaya, etc., is applied to non-selves also. How then do you know that in Atma Anandamaya it denotes the real self? Quote, "The term self," Sutra 16 replies, "is employed here to denote the highest self as in many other passages, Atma va idam eka, etc. As we include from the subsequent passage, namely, he wished, 'May I be many,' end quote. But an objection is raised. Does not the context show that the term self, which in all the preceding clauses about the pranamaya, etc., denoted something other than the self, does the same in Anandamaya Atman, and is not the context of greater weight than a subsequent passage? To this question asked in the former half of 17, Anvayad iti ket, the latter half replies, quote, "Still it denotes the self owing to the affirmatory statement," end quote. That is, the fact of the highest self having been affirmed in a previous passage, also, namely 2:1, quote, "From that self sprang ether," end quote. Adhikarana 9 discusses a minor point connected with the prana-samvara. The subject of Adhikarana 10 has been indicated already above under Adhikarana 1. Adhikarana 11 treats of a case of a contrary nature. In Brihadaranyaka Upanishad 5.5, Brahman is represented first as abiding in the sphere of the sun, and then as abiding within the eye. We therefore, in spite of certain counter-indications, have to do with two separate vidyas. Adhikarana 12 refers to a similar case. Certain attributes of Brahman mentioned in the Ranayaniya Kila have not to be introduced into the corresponding Chandogya Vidya because the stated difference of Brahman's abode involves difference of Vidya. Adhikarana 13 treats of another instance of two Vidyas having to be held apart. Adhikarana 14 decides that certain detached mantras and Brahmana passages met with in the beginning of some Upanishads, as, for instance, a Brahmana about the Mahavrata ceremony at the beginning of the Aitareya Aranyaka, do, notwithstanding their position which seems to connect them with the Brahma Vidya, not belong to the latter, since they show unmistakable signs of being connected with sacrificial acts. Adhikarana 15 treats of the passages stating that the man dying in the possession of true knowledge shakes off all his good and evil deeds, and affirms that a statement, made in some of those passages only, to the effect that the good and evil deeds pass over to the friends and enemies of the deceased, is valid for all the passages. Sutras 27 through 30 constitute, according to Shankara, two adhikaranas, of which the former decides that the shaking off of the good and evil deeds takes place, not as the Kaushitaki Upanishad states, on the road to Brahman's world, but at the moment of the soul's departure from the body. The Kaushitaki statement is therefore not to be taken literally. The latter adhikarana treats of the cognate question whether the soul that has freed itself from its deeds proceeds in all cases on the road of the gods, as said in the Kaushitaki Upanishad, or not. The decision is that he only whose knowledge does not pass beyond the Sagunam Brahma proceeds on that road, while the soul of him who knows the Nirgunam Brahma becomes one with it without moving to any other place. The Sri Bhashya treats the four sutras as one adhikarana, whose two first sutras are explained as by Shankara, while Sutra 29 raises an objection to the conclusion arrived at. Quote, "The going of the soul on the path of the gods has a sense only if the soul's freeing itself from its works takes place in both ways, that is, partly at the moment of death, partly on the road to Brahman, for otherwise there would be a contradiction." End quote. The contradiction being that, if the soul's works were all shaken off at the moment of death, the subtle body would likewise perish at that moment, and then the bodiless soul would be unable to proceed on the path of the gods. To this Sutra 30 replies, quote, "The complete shaking off of the works at the moment of death is possible, since matters of that kind are observed in Scripture." End quote. That is, since scriptural passages show that even he whose works are entirely annihilated, and who has manifested himself in his true shape, is yet connected with some kind of body. Compare the passage, quote, "Param jyotir upasampadya svena rupan abhinishpadyate sa tatra paryete kridan ramamana sasvarad bhavati tasya sarveshu lokeshu kamakaro bhavati." End quote. That subtle body is not due to karman, but to the soul's Vidya Mahatma. That the explanation of the Sri Bhashya agrees with the text as well as Shankara's, a comparison of the two will show. Especially forced is Shankara's explanation of Arthavatvam Ubhayatta, which is said to mean that there is Arthavatva in one case and non-Arthavatva in the other case. The next sutra constitutes an adhikarana, deciding that the road of the gods is followed not only by those knowing the Vidyas which specially mention the going on that road, but by all who are acquainted with the Saguna Vidyas of Brahman. The explanation given in the Sri Bhashya, in which Sutras 31 and 32 have exchanged places, is similar, with the difference, however, that all who meditate on Brahman, without any reference to the distinction of Nirguna and Saguna, proceed after death on the road of the gods. The Sri Bhashya reads Sarvesham, that is, all worshippers, not Sarvasam, all Saguna Vidyas. Adhikarana 19 decides that, although the general effect of true knowledge is release from all forms of body, yet even such beings as have reached perfect knowledge may retain a body for the purpose of discharging certain offices. In the Sri Bhashya, where the sutra follows immediately on Sutra 30, the Adhikarana determines, in close connection with 30, that, although those who know Brahman as a rule divest themselves of the gross body, there remaining only a subtle body which enables them to move, and no longer experience pleasure and pain, yet certain beings, although having reached the cognition of Brahman, remain invested with a gross body, and hence liable to pleasure and pain until they have fully performed certain duties. Adhikarana 20 teaches that the negative attributes of Brahman mentioned in some Vidyas, such as its being not gross, not subtle, etc., are to be included in all meditations on Brahman. Adhikarana 21 determines that Katha Upanishad 3.1 and Mundaka Upanishad 3.1 constitute one Vidya only, because both passages refer to the highest Brahman. According to Ramanuja, the sutra contains a reply to an objection raised against the conclusion arrived at in the preceding sutra. Adhikarana 22 maintains that the two passages, Brihadaranyaka Upanishad 3.4 and 3.5, constitute one Vidya only, the object of knowledge being in both cases Brahman viewed as the inner self of all. Adhikarana 23, on the contrary, decides that the passage Aitareya Aranyaka 2.2.4.6 constitutes not one but two meditations. Adhikarana 24 again determines that the Vidya of the true contained in Brihadaranyaka Upanishad 5.4.5 is one only. According to Ramanuja, Sutras 35 through 38 constitute one Adhikarana only, whose subject is the same as that of 22, according to Shankara. Adhikarana 25 proves that the passages Chandogya Upanishad 8.1 and Brihadaranyaka Upanishad 4.4.22 cannot constitute one Vidya, since the former refers to Brahman as possessing qualities, while the latter is concerned with Brahman as destitute of qualities. Adhikarana 26 treats, according to Shankara, of a minor question connected with Chandogya Upanishad 5.11 forward. According to the Sri Bhashya, Sutras 39 through 41 form one Adhikarana whose first sutra reaches essentially the same conclusion as Shankara under 39. Sutras 40-41 thereupon discuss a general question concerning the meditations on Brahman. The qualities, an opponent is supposed to remark, which in the two passages discussed are predicated of Brahman, such as Vasitva, Satyakamatva, etc., cannot be considered real, paramartika, since other passages, Sa Esha Neti Neti and the like, declare Brahman to be devoid of all qualities. Hence those qualities cannot be admitted into meditations whose purpose is final release. To this objection, Sutra 40 replies, quote, "Those qualities are not to be left off from the meditations on Brahman, since, in the passage under discussion as well as in other passages, they are stated with emphasis." End quote. But another objection is raised. Scripture says that he who meditates on Brahman as Satyakama, etc., obtains a mere perishable reward, namely the world of the fathers, and similar results specified in Chandogya Upanishad 8.2. Hence, he who is desirous of final release must not include those qualities of Brahman in his meditation. To this objection, Sutra 41 replies, quote, "Because that is, the free roaming in all the worlds, the world of the fathers, etc., is stated as proceeding therefrom, that is, the approach to Brahman which is final release, in the case of the soul which has approached Brahman, therefore a person desirous of release may include Satyakamatva, etc., in his meditations." Adhikarana 27 decides that those meditations which are connected with certain matters forming constituent parts of sacrificial actions are not to be considered as permanently requisite parts of the latter. Adhikarana 28 teaches that in a Brihadaranyaka Upanishad passage and a similar Chandogya Upanishad passage, Vayu and Prana are not to be identified, but to be held apart. Adhikarana 29 decides that the fire altars made of mind, etc., which are mentioned in the Agni Rahasya, do not constitute parts of the sacrificial action, so that the mental, etc., construction of the altar could optionally be substituted for the actual one, but merely subjects of meditations. Adhikarana 30 treats, according to Shankara, in the way of digression, of the question whether to the self an existence independent of the body can be assigned or not, as the materialists maintain. According to the Sri Bhashya, The Adhikarana does not refer to this wide question, but is concerned with a point more immediately connected with the meditations on Brahman, namely, the question as to the form under which, in those meditations, the self of the meditating devotee has to be viewed. The two sutras then have to be translated as follows. Quote, "Some maintain that the soul of the devotee has, in meditations, to be viewed as possessing those attributes only which belong to it in its embodied state, such as jnatritva and the like, because the self is, at the time of meditation, in the body." End quote. The next sutra rejects this view. Quote, "This is not so, but the separatedness, that is, the pure isolated state in which the self is at the time of final release when it is freed from all evil, etc., is to be transferred to the meditating self, because that will be the state of the self in the condition of final release." End quote. Adhikarana 31 decides that meditations connected with constituent elements of the sacrifice, such as the Udgita, are, in spite of difference of svara in the Udgita, etc., valid, not only for that sakya in which the meditation actually is met with, but for all sakyas. Adhikarana 32 decides that the Vaishvanara Agni of Chandogya Upanishad 5:11 forward is to be meditated upon as a whole, not in his single parts. Adhikarana 33 teaches that those meditations which refer to one subject, but as distinguished by different qualities, have to be held apart as different meditations. Thus the Dahara Vidya, Sandilya Vidya, etc. remain separate. Adhikarana 34 teaches that those meditations on Brahman for which the texts assign one and the same fruit are optional, there being no reason for their being cumulated. Adhikarana 35 decides that those meditations, on the other hand, which refer to special wishes may be cumulated or optionally employed according to choice. Adhikarana 36 extends this conclusion to the meditations connected with constituent elements of action, such as the Udgita. Pada 4. Adhikarana 1 proves that the knowledge of Brahman is not kratvarta, that is, subordinate to action, but independent. Adhikarana 2 confirms this conclusion by showing that the state of the Pravrajans is enjoined by the sacred law, and that for them vidya only is prescribed, not action. Adhikarana 3 decides that certain clauses forming part of vidyas are not mere stutis, artavadas, but themselves enjoin the meditation. The legends recorded in the Vedanta texts are not to be used as subordinate members of acts, but have the purpose of glorifying, as artavadas, the injunctions with which they are connected. For all these reasons, the Urdhvaretasa require no actions but only knowledge. Nevertheless, the actions enjoined by Scripture, such as sacrifices, conduct of certain kinds, etc., are required as conducive to the rise of vidya in the mind. Certain relaxations allowed by Scripture of the laws regarding food are meant only for cases of extreme need. Vyasrama karamani are obligatory on him also who does not strive after mukti. Those also who, owing to poverty and so on, are anasrama have claims to vidya. An urdhvaretas cannot revoke his vow. Expiation of the fall of an urdhvaretas. Exclusion of the fallen urdhvaretas in certain cases. Those meditations which are connected with subordinate members of the sacrifice are the business of the priest, not of the yajamana. Brihandrayaka Upanishad 3.5.1 enjoins mana as a third in addition to balya and panditya. By balya is to be understood a childlike innocent state of mind. Sutras 51 and 52 discuss, according to Ramanuja, the question when the vidya, which is the result of the means described in 3.4, arises. Sutra 51 treats of that vidya whose result is mere exaltation, abhyudaya, and states that, quote, "it takes place in the present life if there is not present an obstacle in the form of prabala karmantara, in which latter case the vidya arises later only, on account of Scripture declaring this in various passages." End quote. Sutra 52, quote, "Thus there is also absence of a definite rule as to the time of origination of that knowledge whose fruit is release, it being averred concerning that one also that it is in the same condition, that is, of sometimes having an obstacle, sometimes not." End quote. Shankara, who treats the two sutras as two adhikaranas, agrees as to the explanation of 51, while, putting a somewhat forced interpretation on 52, he makes it out to mean that a more or less is possible only in the case of the Saguna Vidyas. Fourth Adhyaya, Pada 1. Adhikarana 1. The meditation on the Atman enjoined by Scripture is not an act to be accomplished once only, but is to be repeated again and again. Adhikarana 2. The devotee engaged in meditation on Brahman is to view it as constituting his own self. Adhikarana 3. To the rule laid down in the preceding Adhikarana, the so-called pratikopasanas, that is, those meditations in which Brahman is viewed under a symbol or outward manifestation, as, for instance, mano brahmati upasita, constitute an exception. That is, the devotee is not to consider the pratika as constituting his own self. Adhikarana 4. In the pratikopasanas, the pratika is to be meditatively viewed as being one with Brahman, not Brahman as being one with the pratika. Ramanuja takes Sutra 5 as simply giving a reason for the decision arrived at under Sutra 4, and therefore as not constituting a new adhikarana. Adhikarana 5. In meditations connected with constitutives of sacrificial works, as, for instance, ya evasau tapatitam udgitam upasita, the idea of the divinity, etc., is to be transferred to the sacrificial item, not vice versa. In the example quoted, for instance, the Udgita is to be viewed as Aditya, not Aditya as the Udgita. Adhikarana 6. The devotee is to carry on his meditations in a sitting posture. Shankara maintains that this rule does not apply to those meditations whose result is samyak darsana, but the sutra gives no hint to that effect. Adhikarana 7. The meditations may be carried on at any time and in any place, favorable to concentration of mind. Adhikarana 8. The meditations are to be continued until death. Shankara again maintains that those meditations which lead to samyak darsana are accepted. Adhikarana 9. When through those meditations the knowledge of Brahman has been reached, the vidvan is no longer affected by the consequences of either past or future evil deeds. Adhikarana 10. Good deeds likewise lose their efficiency. The literal translation of the sutra is, quote, there is likewise non-attachment to the vidvan of the other, that is, of the deeds other than the evil ones, that is, of good deeds, but on the fall of the body, that is, when death takes place, end quote. The last words of the sutra, but on the fall, are separated by Shankara from the preceding part of the sutra and interpreted to mean, quote, when death takes place, there results mukti of the vidvan, who through his knowledge has freed himself from the bonds of works, end quote. According to Ramanuja, the whole sutra simply means, quote, there is likewise non-attachment of good deeds, not at once when knowledge is reached, but on the death of the vidvan, end quote. Adhikarana 11. The non-operation of works stated in the two preceding adhikaranas holds good only in the case of anarabdhakarya works, that is, those works which have not yet begun to produce their effects, while it does not extend to the arabdhakarya works on which the present existence of the devotee depends. Adhikarana 12. From the rule enunciated in Adhikarana 10 are accepted such sacrificial performances as are enjoined permanently, nitya. So, for instance, the Agnihotra, for they promote the origination of knowledge. Adhikarana 13. The origination of knowledge is promoted also by such sacrificial works as are not accompanied with the knowledge of the upasanas, referring to the different members of those works. Adhikarana 14. The arabdhakarya works have to be worked out fully by the fruition of their effects, whereupon the vidvan becomes united with Brahman. The bhoga of the sutra is, according to Shankara, restricted to the present existence of the devotee, since the complete knowledge obtained by him destroys the nescience which otherwise would lead to future embodiments. According to Ramanuja, a number of embodied existences may have to be gone through before the effects of the arabdhakarya works are exhausted. End of section 6.